So congratulations, we are officially under contract. I made this video to be a quick reference guide for you because I know there are so many moving parts in life by itself, much less when you're talking about having to move on top of adulthood. So this is going to be a quick reference guide that you can access day or night and just understand what's coming, where we're at in the process, and just maybe give you a little peace of mind, because I know there's so many details and so many processes that unless you do this for a living like I do, you're just not familiar with. And I just made this so you have a little bit of peace of mind of what's going on in the process, even though we've already had some of these conversations. Okay? So we are here. So we're under contract. This period between this dot and this dot represents the due diligence period, which is the buyer's inspection period in the contract. Now, the buyer during this period can walk away from the contract for any reason whatsoever. It can be a big thing, it can be a nothing thing. It could be they found another house that they like even better and they just want to terminate this. There is no fault to the buyer for terminating, no penalty to the buyer for terminating during this period of time. Now, what the buyer does have to do during this period of time is put up earnest money. Now, that's an agreed upon amount in the contract that is the buyer's earnest intent to move forward and purchase this home. During this period of time, the buyer can terminate the contract and get that earnest money back, no questions asked. Once this period ends, we've done something more than likely called an Amendment to Address Concerns, or ATAC. ATAC is what we call it. And so the buyer in this period of time would have done a home inspection more than likely, and a lot of times there's things that the seller doesn't know of, things in crawl spaces and basements and attics and on roofs and stuff like that come up during the home inspection. And this is where the period of time that we would agree upon any repairs to be done or any credits or concessions to be made between buyer and seller for moving forward with this contract. So that all needs to be done during the due diligence period. Once due diligence ends, the only two circumstances in which the earnest money would come back to the buyer is if the house does not appraise and we cannot come to an agreement between buyer and seller on how to handle that. That's our next step. Or through no fault of the buyer, the lender cannot fund the loan. Okay? Anything else beyond that, the earnest money would go to the seller as their compensation for having their house off the market for a period of time. So once we get past due diligence, we have an appraisal. So the appraisal is a third-party valuation of the property based on the market and the comps in the area. The appraiser works for the bank. They don't work for the buyer. They don't work for the seller. They don't work for any of the brokers involved. They're an independent third party. More than likely, hopefully, the appraisal comes in at the contract price and is clear sailing moving forward as far as that goes. If there's a discrepancy, so let's say the property is $200,000 and the appraisal comes in at $180,000. So we're $20,000 gap. Three things can happen. One, the seller can come down to $180,000 because we've got a neutral third-party opinion on the value of this property and they're evaluating through comps in the market. Two, if the buyer absolutely has to have this property and has an extra $20,000, they can move forward and purchase the property, financing $180,000 of it and coming out of pocket $20,000. Most people don't have that kind of money nor that kind of buy-in for a property, but it does happen sometimes. Or the parties can meet somewhere in the middle. So the seller comes down, the buyer comes up. Anything the buyer comes up above the appraisal price, they're going to have to come out of pocket with at closing. So there's not an amount you can finance from anybody. 9 times out of 10, the seller comes down to the appraisal price. There are some exceptions, but that's by and large what happens if the appraisal comes in low. There is an appeal process if the appraisal comes in low. It's not a high probability process, but there is, for most loans, not all loans, there is an appeal process. It's a maybe 25% chance that you're getting it reversed or adjusted. You just have to have really, really, really strong arguments why some comps should be used instead of the comps the neutral third-party appraiser used in the appraisal. So once the appraisal is done, the attorney during this time is working on something called title, which is basically where they go to the courthouse, they access any records related to the property, they're pulling the title search, and they're making sure that the title is clear to be transferred between ownerships, between buyer and seller. Once the attorney has gotten the title and we're clear on the title, by the way, this is why you get title insurance at closing, even though no one wants to pay for it. This is why, because if you ever go to sell the property and your title is not clear, you got a big issue to deal with. Once we get past this, we get what is called clear to close. Now, we get clear to close once the underwriters for the lender have reviewed the file, made sure all the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, and everything looks good from their vantage point. Underwriters are the most nerve-wracking thing for us in real estate because they're kind of like the IRS in the process. They kind of are their own entity, and without their stamp of approval, nobody moves forward with anything. So it's a little bit of a juggling act, and unfortunately, the underwriters don't usually get the file until about a week before closing. So it can be a little nerve-wracking that last week, but that's just kind of the nature of the process, and unfortunately, we don't have any real say-so in how that's handled. Once the clear to close gets, that's what everybody wants. We want the clear to close, which means the title's clear, the appraisal's good, the underwriters are good, everybody's got what they need, and we move forward to the closing table. 3 days, the reason this gap is here, the clear to close can actually happen on the day of closing. It can be really down to the wire, but 3 days prior, so the reason I didn't draw this is because there's not a hard and fast timeline on when the clear to close has to happen. But you'll get, as the buyer, you have to get the closing disclosures, which are all the numbers. This was something that is a federal law. There's no workaround to this. So if the lender does not get the closing disclosures to the buyer for their signatures, at least 72 hours prior to the closing, we cannot close on that closing date. Now, the numbers may change between when the CD goes to the buyer and when the actual closing happens. If there's something like an HOA fee that was forgotten or things like that, the numbers aren't final, but it is a good ballpark of where the final costs are going to be and how the breakdown is for the buyer. Once all of that happens and we've got past all of this, we go to the closing table. Closings generally take about 45 minutes to an hour each. So if you're selling and then buying and you've got stacked closings, just carve out about 2 hours to be there at the closing attorney's office. The seller side, there's very little to sign. The buyer side, there's a whole lot to sign. So, but ballpark, somewhere around 45 minutes to an hour if everything goes smoothly and there's no issues as far as that goes. Now, if you are the buyer, and I'll remind you of this, but very important, if you are the buyer, within usually about a week, three to 5, 7 days, we're going to send you wiring instructions, which is going to be where you send the money, whatever money that still needs to be brought to closing, which your lender will provide to you, where to send that to your closing attorney. That money gets wired from your bank directly to the closing attorney, nowhere in between. So if you haven't gotten that and you get nervous about that or you forget or something like that, it can be done the day of closing. It doesn't have to be done days in advance. Most people do it within about 24 hours. A wire will usually get wherever it's going within an hour or two, sometimes 3. So it's not something that has to be done days in advance because it just doesn't. It moves pretty quickly. But that's a quick synopsis. I hope it's helpful for you. I'm here to answer any questions, but you can reference this at any point in time and know this is the road to closing.